On the afternoon of March the 23rd, 1984, a 16-year-old girl named Kristina Weber walked into the district headquarters of the Ministry for State Security on Normannenstrasse in East Berlin and told the officer at the reception desk that she had information about anti-state activity. The officer, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and the expression of someone who had heard every possible variation of betrayal, asked her to take a seat and wait. Kristina sat on a hard wooden bench in a corridor that smelled of disinfectant and cigarette smoke for 47 minutes before a Stasi lieutenant named Georg Hartmann called her into his office. Hartmann was 38 years old, had been with the Ministry for State Security for 14 years, and specialized in ideological crimes, cases involving citizens who expressed doubt about the socialist system or maintained contact with Western elements. He gestured for Kristina to sit, placed a notepad on his desk, and asked her to state her full name and address. Kristina answered in a voice that was steady but quiet, as if she were afraid that speaking too loudly would make what she was about to say more real. "My name is Kristina Maria Weber. I live at apartment 4B, 17 Karl Marx Allee with my mother and father. I am here to report that my father is engaged in activities against the German Democratic Republic." Hartmann stopped writing and looked up at her. He had heard many things in his 14 years with the Stasi, but a child reporting her own parent was still noteworthy, still something that carried weight beyond the routine denunciations that flowed through the ministry's offices every day. He asked Kristina what kind of activities she was referring to. Kristina reached into the canvas bag she had been carrying and pulled out a manila folder containing approximately 30 pages of typed documents. She placed the folder on Hartmann's desk and said that she had found these papers hidden in her father's study 2 days earlier. She said she had read them, understood what they were, and believed it was her duty as a citizen of the GDR to report them to the authorities. Hartmann opened the folder and began reading. What he saw made him sit up straighter, lean forward, and signaled to a colleague in the adjacent office to join him. The documents were detailed critiques of the East German government, typed analyses of economic failures, lists of political prisoners, drafts of essays arguing that the German Democratic Republic was not a workers' paradise, but a police state that survived through surveillance and repression. There were names, dates, references to underground dissident networks, and suggestions for how information could be distributed to Western media outlets. It was, in short, evidence of systematic anti-state activity conducted by someone with detailed knowledge of how the system functioned and how to subvert it. Hartmann asked Kristina whose documents these were. She answered without hesitation. "They belong to my father, Klaus Weber. He is a lieutenant colonel in the Ministry for State Security. He works in Department 8, Counterintelligence. He has been with the ministry since 1963. The room went silent. Hartmann and his colleague exchanged looks that conveyed both shock and calculation. A Stasi officer, a lieutenant colonel no less, engaged in anti-state activity was not merely a security breach. It was a crisis, an indication that the rot had reached into the very heart of the organization tasked with protecting the socialist system. If what Kristina was saying was true, if these documents were genuine, then Klaus Weber represented one of the most serious internal threats the ministry had faced in years. Hartmann asked Kristina to wait outside while he and his colleague made phone calls. She was escorted to a different room, given a glass of water, and told not to leave. Over the next 2 hours, the machinery of the Stasi began moving with the efficiency and ruthlessness that had made it one of the most effective security services in the Eastern Bloc. Senior officers were notified, files were pulled, Klaus Weber's employment records were reviewed, his recent activities were analyzed, and a decision was made at the highest levels of the ministry that Klaus Weber needed to be arrested immediately, and that the investigation needed to be conducted with absolute secrecy to prevent him from destroying evidence or fleeing. At 6:47 p.m. on March 23, 1984, Klaus Weber was sitting in his office on the third floor of the Stasi headquarters, reviewing surveillance reports from an operation targeting suspected contact between East German citizens and Western journalists. He was a tall man, lean and precise in his movements, with graying hair and the kind of face that revealed nothing, an occupational necessity for someone who had spent more than 20 years in counterintelligence. He heard footsteps in the corridor outside his office, heavier and more numerous than usual, and he looked up as the door opened without a knock. 4 officers entered, led by a colonel named Ernst Müller, whom Klaus recognized as head of internal investigations. Müller's presence meant something serious was happening, something that involved personnel within the ministry itself. Klaus stood, instinctively understanding that whatever was about to happen was not routine. Müller told him to sit down and informed him that he was under arrest for anti-state activity, ideological subversion, and conspiracy to commit treason. Klaus did not move, did not react visibly, though later accounts suggest he went pale. He asked what evidence supported these charges. Müller placed the manila folder on Klaus's desk, the same folder Kristina had brought to the ministry hours earlier, and told him that his own daughter had provided the documents and had testified that they belonged to him. Klaus looked at the folder, recognized it immediately because he had typed every word in those documents himself over the course of 3 years, and understood with complete clarity that his life as he had known it was over. He was handcuffed, searched, and led out of the building through a side exit to avoid drawing attention from other ministry employees. He was driven to a detention facility in Hohenschönhausen, a complex on the northeastern edge of East Berlin that served as the Stasi's primary interrogation and remand prison. Hohenschönhausen was not a place people talked about, not because it was secret. Everyone in East Berlin knew it existed, but because talking about it could get you sent there. The facility had been designed specifically for holding political prisoners, individuals accused of crimes against the state, and its methods of interrogation were legendarily brutal: psychological manipulation, sensory deprivation, relentless questioning designed to break even the most disciplined minds. Klaus was processed through intake procedures, fingerprinted, photographed, stripped of his belt and shoes, and placed in a cell on the second floor of the main detention block. The cell was approximately 3 meters by 2 meters, contained a narrow bed bolted to the wall, a metal toilet with no seat, and a single bare bulb that remained on 24 hours a day. There was no window, no clock, no way to measure time except by the routine of meals delivered through a slot in the door. Klaus sat on the bed and tried to process what had just happened. His daughter had turned him in, the girl he had raised, the child he had tried to protect from the ugliness of the system he served, had found his private writings and had taken them to the Stasi. The betrayal was so complete, so incomprehensible, that he could not immediately reconcile it with the reality of who Kristina was or who he thought she was. But as the hours passed and the shock gave way to analysis, Klaus began to understand. Kristina was 16 years old, had been raised in the German Democratic Republic, educated in schools that taught loyalty to the party and the state above all else, including family. She had been a member of the Free German Youth since she was 14, had attended ideological training sessions, had been surrounded by propaganda her entire life. From her perspective, what she had done was not betrayal, but duty, reporting anti-state activity regardless of who the perpetrator was. Klaus had always known intellectually that the system he worked for destroyed families, turned children against parents, neighbors against neighbors. But knowing it intellectually and experiencing it directly were entirely different things. The interrogation began the next morning at 7 a.m. Klaus was brought to a windowless room on the ground floor and seated across a metal table from 2 interrogators, one of whom was Ernst Müller, the colonel who had arrested him. The other was a younger officer named Victor Schreiber, who specialized in ideological crimes. Mueller opened the manila folder, spread the documents across the table, and asked Klaus whether he recognized them. Klaus said yes, they were his. There was no point in denying it because his typewriter was in his home study, and forensic analysis would confirm that these documents had been produced on that machine. Lying would only make things worse, though it was hard to imagine how things could be worse. Mueller asked Klaus to explain why he, a lieutenant colonel in the Ministry for State Security, a man entrusted with protecting the German Democratic Republic from internal and external threats, had written documents that criticized the government, cataloged political repression, and outlined strategies for undermining state authority. Klaus considered his answer carefully. He could claim the documents were part of an operation, research for understanding dissident thinking, a cover story that might be plausible if not for the detail and passion in the writing. Or he could tell the truth, which was that over the past 3 years, he had come to believe that the system he served was fundamentally unjust, that the German Democratic Republic was not the workers' paradise it claimed to be, but a totalitarian state that maintained power through fear and surveillance, and that he had begun documenting his thoughts with the vague idea that someday, somehow, they might contribute to change. Klaus chose truth, or at least a version of it. He told Mueller that the documents reflected his personal doubts, that he had not shared them with anyone, that he had not acted on them in any operational sense, that they were private writings he had never intended to distribute. Mueller listened without expression, and then asked the question that would define the rest of the interrogation. Who else knows about this? Who else shares your views? What network are you part of? Klaus insisted there was no network, that his doubts were his alone, that he had not discussed them with colleagues or civilians, that he had written in isolation as a way of processing his thoughts. But Mueller did not believe him. Or perhaps he believed him but needed Klaus to confess to something more substantial to justify the resources that would be invested in this case. The interrogation continued for 11 hours with only brief breaks for water and toilet use. Mueller and Schreiber worked in shifts, one asking questions while the other took notes, then switching roles, a technique designed to keep the subject off balance and exhausted. They demanded names, contacts, methods of communication. They showed Klaus photographs of known dissidents and asked whether he had met them. They read passages from his documents aloud and asked what had inspired specific criticisms. Klaus answered consistently. There was no network, no conspiracy, just a man who had lost faith in the system he served. But consistency was not enough to satisfy the interrogators. On the 3rd day of detention, Klaus was informed that his home had been searched, that additional documents had been found, and that his wife, Helga Weber, was being held for questioning. Klaus felt his control slip for the first time since his arrest. Helga knew nothing about his writings, had no idea he harbored doubts about the GDR, had lived her life as a loyal citizen, working as a school teacher and raising Kristina according to the values the state expected. Involving her in this investigation was unnecessary, punitive, designed to pressure Klaus into cooperation. He told Mueller that his wife was innocent, that she had no knowledge of his activities, that any attempt to implicate her would be false. Mueller responded that Helga's innocence or guilt would be determined through investigation, not through Klaus's assurances. Meanwhile, Kristina Weber was experiencing the consequences of her decision in ways she had not anticipated. After providing her initial statement to Lieutenant Hartmann on March 23rd, she had been allowed to return home with instructions not to discuss the matter with anyone. She had walked back to the apartment on Karl Marx Allee, climbed the 4 flights of stairs, and entered the quiet space where she had lived her entire life. Her mother was in the kitchen preparing dinner, and Kristina had sat at the table, unable to eat, unable to explain where she had been. Helga asked whether something was wrong, and Kristina said she was tired, that school had been difficult. It was a lie, but a small one compared to what was coming. The next morning, March 24th, Stasi officers arrived at the apartment at 6 a.m., knocked loudly, and when Helga opened the door, informed her that her husband had been arrested and that the apartment was being searched as part of a state security investigation. Helga, shocked and terrified, asked what Klaus had been arrested for, but the officers told her only that it involved anti-state activity and that she needed to cooperate fully. The search took 5 hours. Officers went through every drawer, every closet, every shelf. They confiscated Klaus's typewriter, his personal notebooks, letters he had written but never sent, books that were technically legal but ideologically suspect. They questioned Helga about her husband's activities, his associations, his recent behavior. She answered truthfully, saying she knew nothing about any anti-state activity, that Klaus had never discussed politics at home beyond what was necessary for his work, that he had seemed normal, unchanged. The officers took her at her word for the moment, but they also informed her that she would be required to come to ministry headquarters for further questioning. Kristina watched all of this from her room, where she had been told to remain during the search. She saw her mother's confusion and fear, saw the officers dismantling the home she had grown up in, and began to feel the first stirrings of doubt about what she had done. She had believed, when she walked into the Stasi headquarters 2 days earlier, that she was protecting the German Democratic Republic, that her father's writings were dangerous, that reporting them was the correct and patriotic action. But seeing the consequences unfold, seeing her mother's distress, seeing the violence of the state apparatus turning against her own family, made the abstract principles she had believed in feel less certain. Over the following weeks, the investigation expanded. Klaus was interrogated daily, subjected to sleep deprivation, confined in isolation, questioned about every detail of his life and work. Miller and his team were building a case that went beyond private doubts. They were constructing a narrative in which Klaus Weber had been part of a larger conspiracy, a network of disaffected Stasi officers who were planning to undermine the ministry from within. The evidence for this conspiracy was thin, based primarily on Klaus's own writings and on interpretations of his professional conduct that, when viewed through the lens of suspicion, could be made to seem subversive. But thin evidence was sufficient in the Stasi's world, where the presumption of guilt was stronger than the presumption of innocence. Helga was interrogated 3 times over the course of 2 weeks. She was asked whether she had noticed changes in her husband's behavior, whether he had mentioned dissatisfaction with his work, whether he had contacts with foreigners or access to Western media. She answered no to all of these questions because the answers were true, but her truthfulness was interpreted as either ignorance or complicity, and the interrogators could not decide which. Eventually, after multiple sessions and finding no evidence that Helga had been involved in Klaus's activities, the Stasi concluded that she was not a conspirator, but rather a victim of her husband's deception. However, being a victim did not exempt her from consequences. On April 10, 1984, Helga was informed that she was being dismissed from her teaching position due to her husband's crimes, that she was being placed under surveillance, and that she would be required to report to the local police station once a week to confirm her residence and activities. The loss of her job was devastating, not just financially but socially, because in East Germany, employment was more than a source of income. It was a marker of status, of trustworthiness, of one's place in the socialist collective. Losing a job for political reasons marked you as unreliable, made you an outcast, ensured that neighbors would avoid you and that opportunities would be closed to you and your family. Kristina, meanwhile, was continuing to attend school, but the atmosphere had changed. Word had spread, as it always did in East Berlin, where gossip and rumor filled the gaps left by official silence, that her father had been arrested by the Stasi and that Kristina herself had been the one to report him. Some of her classmates treated her as a hero, a model of socialist loyalty who had placed duty above family. Others avoided her, uncomfortable with the idea of someone who would betray their own parent, even for ideological reasons. Kristina found herself isolated, praised by authorities and Young Pioneers leaders, but friendless among her peers. And increasingly she found herself questioning whether what she had done had been right. The propaganda she had absorbed her entire life told her that loyalty to the state was paramount, that the German Democratic Republic needed to be protected from enemies both external and internal, that personal relationships were secondary to collective responsibility. But the reality of what her actions had caused, her father arrested, her mother jobless and under surveillance, her family destroyed, made those abstract principles feel hollow. On the evening of April 15, 1984, Kristina sat in the apartment with her mother, the two of them eating a silent dinner of bread and soup. Helga had not spoken directly about what Kristina had done, had not accused her or condemned her, but the silence between them was heavy with unspoken grief and anger. Finally, Kristina asked the question she had been avoiding. "Do you hate me?" Helga looked at her daughter for a long moment, and then said, "I don't know what I feel. You did what you believed was right, but right or wrong, you destroyed this family." Klaus's trial was scheduled for May 22, 1984. It would be a closed proceeding, held in a special court that handled cases involving state security, with no public access and no independent legal representation. Klaus was assigned a state-appointed attorney who met with him once for 30 minutes and advised him to plead guilty and express remorse, which was the only strategy that might result in a reduced sentence. Klaus understood that the trial was a formality, that the verdict had already been determined, that his role was simply to confess publicly and accept punishment. The trial lasted 4 hours. The prosecution presented the documents Kristina had provided, additional materials seized during the search of Klaus's home, and testimony from colleagues who, under pressure, described Klaus as reserved, possibly hiding something, though none had direct evidence of anti-state activity. Klaus was given the opportunity to speak in his own defense, and he used that opportunity not to deny the charges but to explain. He said that he had joined the Ministry for State Security in 1963 because he believed in the ideals of socialism, believed that the German Democratic Republic could be a just society, a place where workers were truly valued and where the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. But over the course of 21 years, he had seen the gap between those ideals and the reality of how the system functioned. He had seen good people arrested for minor deviations from orthodoxy, had seen families torn apart by surveillance and denunciation, had seen the state use fear as its primary tool of control. He said he had written his thoughts down not as preparation for action, but as a way of preserving his sanity, of holding on to the belief that truth still mattered even when speaking truth was forbidden. He said he understood that what he had done was illegal, that he had violated the trust placed in him as an officer of the ministry, and that he accepted responsibility for that. But he also said that the German Democratic Republic's greatest weakness was not external enemies, but its refusal to tolerate any internal criticism, its insistence that loyalty required silence even in the face of injustice. The judges listened impassively and retired to deliberate. They returned 20 minutes later with a verdict. Klaus Weber was found guilty of anti-state agitation, ideological subversion, and abuse of his position within the Ministry for State Security. He was sentenced to death by firing squad. The sentence was to be carried out within 30 days. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Klaus showed no reaction, standing rigid and expressionless as he had been trained to do during his years in counterintelligence. But inside, he felt a strange mixture of relief and resignation. Relief that the uncertainty was over. Resignation that there would be no appeal, no reprieve, no possibility of anything other than the outcome that had been decided before the trial even began. He was returned to Hohenschönhausen and placed in a cell designated for condemned prisoners, a slightly larger space than his previous cell but equally isolated, equally devoid of comfort or hope. He was allowed to write one final letter to his family, though he was told the letter would be reviewed and might not be delivered if it contained anything deemed inappropriate. Klaus wrote to Helga and Kristina, telling them he loved them, that he bore them no ill will, that he hoped they would find a way to rebuild their lives. He told Kristina specifically that he understood why she had done what she did, that she had been taught to value loyalty to the state above all else, and that he did not blame her for following the principles she had been raised to believe. He asked her only to remember that principles, no matter how sincerely held, could be used to justify terrible things, and that she should never stop questioning whether the authority she obeyed deserved that obedience. The letter was reviewed, partially redacted, and eventually delivered to Helga 2 weeks after Klaus's execution. On June 12, 1984, at 6 a.m., Klaus Weber was taken from his cell to a courtyard behind the detention facility. He was positioned against a concrete wall marked with bullet holes and stains from previous executions. A 5-man firing squad stood 10 meters away, their rifles loaded. An officer read the sentence aloud, confirming that Klaus had been found guilty of crimes against the German Democratic Republic, and that the sentence of death was to be carried out immediately. Klaus was asked if he had any final words. He said only, "Tell my daughter I forgive her." The officer gave the command. The rifles fired. Klaus collapsed. A doctor confirmed death, and the body was removed. According to standard procedure, Klaus was buried in an unmarked grave in a restricted section of the Friedrichsfelde Cemetery. No marker was placed, no record of the location was provided to the family. Helga was notified of her husband's execution by a brief letter from the ministry that arrived on June 14th. The letter stated that Klaus Weber had been executed for crimes against the state, and that his remains would not be returned to the family. It also informed Helga that as the wife of a convicted traitor, she was required to relocate from her current residence within 30 days, that her right to travel within the GDR was restricted, and that she would remain under surveillance indefinitely. Kristina was present when her mother received the letter. She saw Helga read it, saw her mother's face crumple, saw her sink into a chair and begin to cry in a way Kristina had never witnessed before, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from a place beyond grief. Kristina wanted to comfort her, wanted to say something, but she had no words that could undo what had been done. She retreated to her room and sat on her bed, staring at the wall, trying to process the knowledge that her father was dead, that her actions had led directly to his execution, and that no amount of belief in socialist principles could justify or erase that fact. The aftermath of Klaus Weber's execution unfolded across multiple tracks simultaneously, each devastating in its own way. Helga Weber, who received notification of her husband's death on June 14, 1984, was given 30 days to vacate the apartment on Karl Marx Allee, where the family had lived for 16 years. The forced relocation was not merely punitive logistics, it was ideological purification. The wife and daughter of a convicted traitor could not be permitted to occupy state housing in a central Berlin location where other residents, loyal citizens of the German Democratic Republic, might be contaminated by their presence. On July 12, 1984, Helga and Kristina moved to a one-bedroom apartment in Marzahn, a sprawling housing development on the eastern edge of East Berlin, consisting of identical concrete tower blocks that had been constructed in the 1970s to address housing shortages. The apartment was on the 8th floor of a 12-story building, accessible only by an elevator that frequently broke down. The building smelled of mildew and old cabbage. The walls were thin enough that neighbors' arguments could be heard clearly, and the view from the window showed nothing but more identical buildings stretching to the horizon. Helga found work, though finding is perhaps the wrong word, as a cleaning woman at a hospital in Lichtenberg. It was the only employment available to her given that her personnel file now carried the permanent notation, relative of state criminal. The work was physically exhausting, scrubbing floors, emptying waste bins, cleaning bathrooms. She worked 6 days a week, 10 hours a day for wages barely sufficient to cover rent and basic food. The other cleaning staff avoided her once they learned who she was. Hospital administrators watched her carefully, looking for any sign of ideological unreliability that might justify dismissal. She worked in silence, spoke to no one unless necessary, and came home each evening exhausted to the point of collapse. Kristina, meanwhile, was experiencing the consequences of her actions in ways that became more complex and psychologically damaging as she matured enough to understand what she had done. At 16, she had believed she was protecting the German Democratic Republic from internal enemies. She had been raised to believe that loyalty to the state transcended loyalty to family, that reporting anti-state activity was not betrayal, but duty. But living with the reality of her father's execution, watching her mother work herself to exhaustion, enduring the isolation and stigma that marked them as traitors' relatives, forced Kristina to confront questions she had not considered when she walked into Stasi headquarters with her father's documents. Had her father actually posed a threat to anyone? Had his private writings, critical though they were, justified his death? Had she done the right thing, or had she simply been a tool that the system used to destroy a man who dared to think differently? These questions tormented her through the summer and fall of 1984. She tried to discuss them with her mother, but Helga was too grief-stricken and exhausted to engage in philosophical debates about loyalty and morality. She tried to find answers in the ideological training she had received through the Free German Youth. But the slogans that had seemed so clear and compelling before now felt hollow and inadequate. And she began to notice things about the society she lived in that she had never questioned before. The pervasive surveillance, the restrictions on speech and travel, the way people looked over their shoulders before saying anything that might be interpreted as criticism. Kristina finished her secondary education in June 1985 and applied for admission to the Humboldt University in East Berlin to study literature. Her application was rejected without explanation, though the reason was clear from the notation in her file. She was the daughter of Klaus Weber, convicted traitor, and despite her demonstrated loyalty in reporting her father, the state did not trust her enough to grant access to higher education. She applied for various jobs, positions at libraries, bookstores, administrative offices. Most applications were rejected. The few interviews she received ended abruptly when her family background was revealed. In September 1985, she was assigned through the state labor allocation system to work at a textile factory in Köpenick, a position that required no qualifications and offered no prospects for advancement. She worked on an assembly line sewing buttons onto shirts for 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, surrounded by women who spoke only of shortages, husbands, and children. The work was mind-numbing, repetitive, designed for people who had no ambitions beyond survival. Kristina endured it because she had no choice, but every day felt like a punishment, a life sentence for the crime of having destroyed her father. The relationship between Kristina and Helga deteriorated over the months following Klaus's execution. Helga never directly accused her daughter, never said explicitly that Kristina was responsible for Klaus's death. but the silence between them was heavy with unspoken grief and anger. They lived in the same small apartment, shared meals in silence, passed each other in the narrow hallway without making eye contact. Helga worked during the day, came home exhausted, ate a simple dinner, and went to bed. Kristina worked her shifts at the factory, came home to an apartment that felt more like a prison, and spent her evenings reading books she borrowed from the state library, trying to find something in literature that would help her make sense of what her life had become. On the evening of November 9th, 1985, the first anniversary of Klaus's arrest, Helga finally spoke. She had been sitting at the kitchen table staring at a photograph of Klaus taken years earlier when he had been young and smiling, before the weight of living in the GDR had aged him prematurely. Kristina came home from her shift at the factory and found her mother crying quietly. Kristina sat down across from her, and after several minutes of silence, Helga looked up and asked the question she had been holding back for more than a year. "Why did you do it?" Kristina had no good answer. She said she had believed it was the right thing, that she had been taught loyalty to the state came first, that she had thought she was protecting the GDR from enemies. Helga listened without expression, and then said something that would haunt Kristina for the rest of her life. "Your father loved you more than anything in this world, and you killed him for a system that doesn't care whether you live or die." The words were not shouted, not delivered with anger, but spoken quietly with a finality that made them impossible to dismiss or argue against. Kristina had no response. She sat at the table long after her mother had gone to bed, replaying the conversation, replaying every decision she had made, trying to find some way to justify what she had done. But she could not. The truth, which she was finally beginning to accept, was that she had destroyed her family for nothing, for abstract principles that meant nothing in the face of the concrete reality of her father's death and her mother's suffering. Over the next 3 years, Kristina's mental state deteriorated. She developed insomnia, lying awake at night replaying the moment she had walked into Stasi headquarters, imagining what would have happened if she had simply burned the documents instead of reporting them, if she had confronted her father directly instead of turning him in. She lost weight, stopped eating regularly, stopped caring about her appearance. Co-workers at the factory noticed she had become withdrawn, speaking only when necessary, staring into space during breaks. In 1987, she was briefly hospitalized after collapsing at work from exhaustion and malnutrition. Doctors diagnosed her with depression and prescribed medication, but medication could not address the fundamental problem, which was that she was living with guilt that had no resolution, grief that had no outlet, and regret that could not be undone. The fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989, came as a shock to most East Germans, but for Kristina it was profoundly disorienting. The system she had been raised to serve, the system she had destroyed her family to protect, collapsed within weeks. The Stasi was dissolved, its files seized, its officers investigated. The ideological certainty that had justified every aspect of GDR life was revealed as propaganda built on lies and maintained through fear. Kristina watched on television as crowds tore down the wall, as East and West Berliners embraced, as politicians who had ruled for decades fled or were arrested. And what she felt was not joy or hope, but a kind of numb devastation, the understanding that her father had been right, that the GDR had been exactly what he said it was, a police state that survived through surveillance and repression. In January 1990, the newly formed government of a reunifying Germany began the process of opening Stasi files to victims of repression. Citizens could apply to access their own files, to see what had been documented about them, who had informed on them, what the state had known. Helga applied immediately, driven by a need to understand exactly what had happened to Klaus, what evidence had been used against him, who had been involved in his investigation. The file arrived in March 1990. Approximately 200 pages of typed reports, handwritten notes, surveillance logs, interrogation transcripts, and court documents. Helga read through it over the course of a single night, sitting at the kitchen table with a lamp, turning pages that documented her husband's destruction in bureaucratic detail. The file confirmed what they had suspected, that Klaus had been arrested based on Kristina's report, that the documents she had provided had been the primary evidence used against him, that without her intervention, Klaus would likely never have come to the Stasi's attention. But the file also revealed something Helga had not known. Klaus's final letter, the one he had written before his execution, had been heavily redacted before being delivered to her. The unredacted version, preserved in the file, contained the full text of what Klaus had wanted to say. He wrote that he understood why Kristina had done what she did, that she had been raised in a system that taught children to prioritize state loyalty over family, that he did not blame her for following the principles she had been taught to believe. He wrote that his greatest regret was not that he had been arrested, but that he had failed to teach his daughter to question authority, to think critically, to recognize that principles, no matter how sincerely held, could be used to justify terrible things. He wrote that he hoped someday she would understand that loyalty should be to truth and to people, not to systems that demanded obedience without question. He asked Helga to tell Kristina, when she was old enough to understand, that he forgave her. But that forgiveness did not mean what she had done was right. It meant only that he loved her and understood the circumstances that had led to her decision. Helga showed the letter to Kristina. They sat together in the kitchen, the same place where Klaus had once sat typing the documents that would lead to his arrest, and Kristina read her father's final words. She read them twice, then folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table. She did not cry. She had cried too much already and had no tears left. She simply sat in silence, staring at the letter, trying to absorb the reality that her father had forgiven her, but that she could never forgive herself. The reunification of Germany in October 1990 brought economic opportunities for many East Germans, but for Helga and Kristina, it brought primarily dislocation. The textile factory where Kristina worked closed down, unable to compete with Western manufacturers. The hospital where Helga cleaned was privatized, and many longtime staff were let go in favor of younger, more educated workers. Both women found themselves unemployed in a reunified Berlin that had little use for people marked by their association with the old regime. Helga found occasional work, cleaning private homes, paid under the table by West Berliners who needed cheap labor and did not ask questions. Kristina applied for jobs constantly, but her education had ended at secondary school. Her work experience was limited to factory assembly lines, and her gaps in employment and the notations in her personnel file from the GDR years made her an unattractive candidate. In 1992, Kristina attempted suicide for the first time. She swallowed a bottle of sleeping pills and was found unconscious by Helga, who called an ambulance. Kristina was hospitalized, her stomach pumped, and she was placed under psychiatric observation for 2 weeks. The psychiatrist who treated her, a West German woman named Dr. Monika Schmidt, diagnosed her with severe depression, PTSD, and what Schmidt described as complex moral injury, psychological damage resulting from having committed an act that violated her own fundamental values, even though at the time she had believed the act was morally justified. Dr. Schmidt recommended long-term therapy, but the cost was prohibitive for someone with no income and minimal state support. Kristina was released with a prescription for antidepressants and instructions to return for follow-up appointments she could not afford. Over the next several years, Kristina cycled through periods of relative stability and acute crisis. She worked sporadically, temporary positions that lasted weeks or months before ending. She attended support groups for former GDR citizens struggling with the transition to reunified Germany, but she could not bring herself to share her story with others. How could she explain that she had turned her father into the Stasi? How could she expect understanding or sympathy from people who had been victims of the same system she had served? She remained isolated, living with her mother in the Marzahn apartment, watching her mother age rapidly under the weight of grief and exhaustion, knowing that she was responsible for the destruction of their lives. Helga Weber died on April 3, 1998, at the age of 61, from a heart attack while riding the bus home from a cleaning job. She collapsed in her seat, and by the time the bus driver realized something was wrong and called an ambulance, she was already dead. Kristina identified her mother's body at the hospital, arranged for a minimal funeral service, and buried her in a cemetery on the outskirts of Berlin in a grave marked with a simple stone bearing her name and dates. Kristina was 30 years old and completely alone. The Stasi records that documented Klaus Weber's case were eventually transferred to the archives of the Federal Commissioner for the Stasi Records, an agency established to manage the millions of files left behind by East Germany's secret police. Researchers and journalists occasionally accessed Klaus's file as part of broader studies on Stasi repression and the mechanisms of totalitarian control. In 2003, a German historian named Dr. Thomas Richter published a book titled The Children Who Betrayed, examining cases in which young East Germans had informed on their own parents to the Stasi. Klaus Weber's case was featured prominently in the book, with a full chapter devoted to analyzing the circumstances of his arrest, the content of his writings, and the role his daughter had played in his downfall. Richter's analysis was sympathetic to Kristina, noting that she had been 16 years old at the time, that she had been subjected to intensive ideological indoctrination her entire life, that the GDR had systematically taught children to prioritize state loyalty over family bonds. He argued that Kristina was as much a victim of the system as her father, that blaming her for following the principles she had been taught was unfair, and that the real responsibility lay with the Stasi officers who had exploited her report and with the regime that had created a society where children could be turned into informants against their own parents. The book received significant attention in Germany, generating debates about responsibility, guilt, and forgiveness in the context of the GDR's collapse. Richter was invited to speak at universities and conferences, and excerpts from the book were published in newspapers and magazines. In November 2003, Richter attempted to contact Kristina for a follow-up interview, hoping to include her perspective in a second edition of the book. He tracked her down through public records and sent a letter to her address in Marzahn, explaining who he was and what he was researching. He emphasized that he was not interested in judging her, that he wanted only to understand her experience and to give her an opportunity to tell her own story. Kristina did not respond. The idea of being interviewed, of having her story told publicly, of being identified as the girl who had turned her father into the Stasi, was unbearable. She had spent the past 19 years trying to survive the guilt and grief of what she had done, and the thought of becoming a public figure, of being analyzed and debated by academics and journalists, felt like a violation she could not endure. She burned Richter's letter and tried to forget it had ever arrived, but the letter had reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Kristina began drinking heavily, using alcohol to numb the constant awareness of what she had done and what she had lost. She lost her part-time job at a grocery store after showing up drunk multiple times. She stopped paying rent and was evicted from the Marzahn apartment in early 2004. She moved into a homeless shelter, a grim facility that housed approximately 40 people, mostly men, in bunk beds arranged in a large dormitory room. The shelter provided meals and a place to sleep, but it was noisy, dangerous, and offered no privacy or dignity. Kristina lasted 3 months there before deciding she could not continue living this way. On June 2, 2004, Kristina Weber walked to the Oberbaumbrücke, the historic bridge connecting the Kreuzberg and Friedrichshain districts of Berlin. It was early morning, before dawn, and the streets were largely empty. She climbed over the railing on the north side of the bridge, stood for a moment looking down at the dark water of the Spree River below, and jumped. Her body was recovered later that morning by police. She was 36 years old. The police investigation determined that the death was a suicide. A note was found in Kristina's jacket pocket, written on a crumpled piece of paper in handwriting that was shaky but legible. The note contained 3 sentences. "I killed my father. I destroyed my family. I cannot live with what I have done." The note was filed with the police report, and the case was closed. Kristina was buried in the same cemetery where her mother had been buried 6 years earlier, in an adjacent plot. The gravestones are simple, identical in size and style, bearing only names and dates. There is no indication of the relationship between the 2 women, no mention of Klaus, no acknowledgement of the tragedy that destroyed their family. But researchers and historians who have studied the Weber case know where the graves are, and occasionally someone visits, placing flowers on the stones, standing in silence for a few moments before leaving. The broader legacy of the Weber case extends beyond the individual tragedy of one family. It serves as one of the most stark examples of how the East German state used ideology to penetrate the most intimate relationships, turning children into potential informants and families into sites of surveillance. The Stasi understood that total control required reaching into private spaces, into homes and conversations that occurred behind closed doors, and children, who could be molded through education and youth organizations, were particularly valuable sources because they had access to information that adults carefully guarded from outsiders. Between 1950 and 1989, thousands of East German children informed on their parents to the Stasi. The exact number will never be known because many files were destroyed during the chaotic final days of the GDR, but archival research suggests that the practice was systematic and encouraged. Teachers were trained to identify children whose parents expressed ideological doubts. Youth organization leaders were instructed to cultivate loyalty to the state over loyalty to family. And children who demonstrated their commitment by reporting their own parents were often praised as examples of socialist virtue, at least until the system collapsed, and such behavior was reframed as tragic complicity in totalitarian repression. The psychological damage inflicted on these children, on young people like Kristina who grew up to realize they had been manipulated into betraying the people who loved them most, is incalculable. Studies conducted after reunification found that many former child informants suffered from depression, PTSD, substance abuse, and difficulty forming trusting relationships. Suicide rates among this population were significantly higher than among other former GDR citizens, and support services specifically designed to help them were limited because there was societal ambivalence about whether these individuals deserved sympathy or should be held accountable for their actions. Kristina Weber's story raises uncomfortable questions about responsibility and culpability in totalitarian systems. Was she a victim or a perpetrator? The answer is that she was both. She was victimized by a system that indoctrinated her from birth, that taught her to value state loyalty above all else, that exploited her ideological commitment to destroy her own father. But she was also responsible for the choice she made to take those documents to the Stasi, to provide testimony that led directly to Klaus's execution. The fact that she was young, that she had been manipulated, that she believed she was doing the right thing, these factors provide context but do not erase responsibility. And Kristina herself clearly understood this, which is why she could not forgive herself, why her guilt became unbearable, why she ultimately chose to end her life rather than continue carrying the weight of what she had done. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany brought freedom and opportunity to millions of people who had lived under communist rule. But for people like Kristina, the collapse of the GDR brought primarily the devastating realization that the system they had served, the principles they had believed in, the actions they had taken in service of those principles, had been in service of a lie. The GDR had not been a workers' paradise. It had been a police state maintained through fear, surveillance, and the systematic destruction of anyone who dared to question its legitimacy. And the children who had been raised to defend that state, who had informed on their parents and neighbors and friends, were left to grapple with the knowledge that they had been tools of oppression, that their loyalty had been exploited, that they had destroyed lives for nothing. Klaus Weber's grave, like those of Helga and Kristina, is marked with a simple stone in an unremarkable cemetery on the outskirts of Berlin. There is no memorial to him, no plaque acknowledging that he was executed for writing private thoughts that criticize the government. His story is known primarily through the Stasi file that documented his arrest, trial, and execution, a file that sits in the archives alongside thousands of others that tell similar stories of ordinary people destroyed by the East German state. The photograph that Kristina took from her father's study, the manila folder containing his writings, the documents that led to his execution, these items were confiscated by the Stasi and became part of the evidence file used in his prosecution. After reunification, the file was transferred to the Federal Commissioner's archives where it remains accessible to researchers who have the proper authorization. The documents Klaus wrote, his critiques of the GDR, his observations about economic failures and political repression, his arguments that the revolution's promises had been betrayed, these writings read today as accurate assessments of a system that was fundamentally unjust. But in 1984, in the context of a totalitarian state that tolerated no criticism, they were evidence of treason, punishable by death. The tragedy of the Weber family is not unique. It is one story among thousands, one family among countless others destroyed by systems that valued ideology over humanity, control over freedom, the state over the individual. But it is a story worth remembering precisely because it is not exceptional, because it illustrates how ordinary people, people who were not heroes or dissidents or political activists, could be caught in the machinery of repression and ground down simply for thinking differently, for questioning authority, for wanting something better. And it serves as a reminder of what is lost when children are taught to betray their parents, when loyalty to abstract principles is elevated above loyalty to actual human beings, when systems of control penetrate so deeply into private life that even families cannot trust one another. The graves where Klaus, Helga, and Kristina are buried receive few visitors. Most people who pass through the cemetery have no idea who they were or what happened to them. But their story endures in the Stasi archives, in academic studies, in books like Dr. Richter's that examine the human cost of totalitarianism. It endures as a testament to what was lost, to lives destroyed not by war or natural disaster, but by a system that demanded absolute obedience and destroyed anyone who hesitated. And it stands as a warning about the dangers of ideological certainty, about what happens when we allow principles to override compassion, when we choose loyalty to systems over loyalty to people, when we forget that behind every political decision, every act of state power, every ideology, there are individual human beings whose lives can be shattered in an instant.